So let's all hear it for Kevin Convery. Okay, can we please, everybody, sit down now, and we're going to start our Sunday service. We're not... Everyone?
Oh, we can't even hear you. I didn't hear you.
You can't hear me?
I didn't hear you. Y'all doing the testimonies now, or what? I didn't even hear you.
No, we're doing sermon.
Sorry. Yeah.
This is a service, actually. Yeah. That's good. You can hear me, right? Well, happy St. Patrick's Day.
Happy St. Patrick's Day.
So when I mentioned St. Patrick's Day, what are some of your associations? Dancing?
Roman Empire.
Huh?
The Roman Empire.
Yeah, usually it's a holiday. People associate things like green beer and leprechauns and green carnations, things like that. It's actually kind of a silly holiday, and shamrocks and leprechauns. Kind of a bit of a silly holiday. We celebrate the Irish immigrants who came to America in the 19th century, and had a big influence on American culture. But in Ireland, it's actually a holy day. It's not celebrated the same way. It's recognized as a holy day. So what I'm going to talk about today is the story behind the story. Two popular misconceptions. St. Patrick did not kick the snakes out of Ireland. There never were any snakes in Ireland to begin with. Also, he was not Irish. Patrick was a Romanized Briton. Came from what's today England, the island of England. There's an amazing story behind all this, which whether we know it or not, has shaped all of our lives in some very profound ways. I'm going to start out, give you a little bit of the geopolitics of the time of Patrick. In about 400 AD, the Roman Empire had pretty much crumbled. It was being devastated by barbarian tribes, names like the Huns, the Goths, and the Vandals. Even just those names, they sound destructive. The Goths, the Huns, the Vandals. See, we talk about vandalism today. It comes from the Germanic tribe called the Vandals, which helped overrun the Roman Empire in the 4th and 5th centuries. So Europe was being plunged into what we refer to today as the Dark Ages. Long before the High Middle Ages, after the collapse of the Roman Empire, Europe became essentially illiterate overnight. It's not because we don't call them the Dark Ages because it was physically dark. It wasn't cloudy and the weather wasn't bad. But there had been generations of Roman literacy and education. The barbarians were basically illiterate, and Rome had accepted Christianity as the official religion of the empire in 313 AD. So by 400, Europe was kind of a Christian kingdom. The barbarian tribes, the Germanic tribes, the Goths, the Vandals, the Huns, were not Christian. They were illiterate and unchristian, and they dominated all of Europe, as far as the British Isles. But Ireland, actually, which was also a pagan nation, basically a rural country full of tribes, various tribes and warlords, had never been conquered by Rome. So it was the only country in Europe that was not part of the Roman Empire. And it's as far west as you can go, except for Iceland, in Europe. So Ireland was still basically independent of the Roman Empire. It didn't experience the fall of the Roman Empire as other nations in Europe did. And the Irish were always, as they still are today, pretty feisty. So in this dark time, in these dark ages for Europe, they were raiding the Britons. Britons were basically Romanized people. They'd been under the dominion of Rome for maybe almost 300 years. So the Irish were raiding them. And there was a boy growing up in Britain, a little bit spoiled, a little bit careless, well-educated, 16-year-old boy named Patricius. He was a Romanized Briton from a wealthy and prosperous family. He was taken in a raid. The Irish used to come and raid the coast of Britain for slaves. Slavery was quite a functioning institution in Ireland at that time. And these raiding parties again would come and raid Britain. They captured young Patricius at age 16. Took him in a boat across the Irish Sea, sold him to an Irish, he was kind of a petty chief, petty warlord, somewhere in southeastern Ireland. And Patricius actually was put to work as a shepherd boy, which means he was given a herd of sheep and banished alone to the countryside, where he was responsible for looking after his master's sheep. Not a very comfortable occupation, being a slave shepherd in Ireland in 400 AD. He didn't have much to wear, didn't have a whole lot to eat, and no real companionship. He didn't speak the language. They spoke Gaelic in Ireland, Latin in Britain, in the British Isles. So he was at a profound disadvantage. He went through a lot of privation. I'll read you a passage from a book I very much recommend called How the Irish Saved Civilization, about the situation of young Patrick as a shepherd boy in Ireland. Specs. The life of a shepherd's slave could not have been a happy one. Ripped out of civilization, Patricius had for his only protector a man who did not hold his own life very highly, let alone anyone else's. The work of such shepherds was bitterly isolated, months at a time spent alone in the hills. We know that he did have two constant companions, hunger and nakedness, and that the gnawing in his belly and the chill on his exposed skin were his worst sufferings, acutely painful presences that could not be shaken off. From this scant information, Patricius is not a man of many words. We can deduce that the boy had a hardy constitution and had probably been a beloved and well-nourished child. Otherwise, he could not have survived. Like many another in impossible circumstances, he began to pray. He had never before paid attention to the teachings of his religion. He tells us that he didn't really believe in God, and he found priests foolish. But now there was no one to turn to but the God of his parents. One is reminded of the reports of contemporary hostages about how they make it through the dreary years of captivity. Tending flocks was my daily work. and I would pray constantly during the daylight hours. The love of God and the fear of Him surrounded me more and more, and faith grew and the Spirit was roused, so that in one day I would say as many as 100 prayers, and after dark nearly as many again, even while I remained in the woods or on the mountain. I would wake and pray before daybreak, through snow, frost, rain, nor was there any sluggishness in me, such as I experience nowadays, because then the Spirit within me was ardent. Sounds like somebody else that I know. So he was basically he was a slave in Ireland for some six and a half years. He went from age 16 to age 22, as a shepherd slave out on the countryside. And then he prayed, and he was just constantly praying. And one night he had a vision. I forget exactly that one, but in a dream, a spirit came and told him, "Your ship is waiting for you at the coast. Go now." And Patrick got up, he obeyed the vision, got up, packed his few things, whatever they were, started the 200-mile trip on foot in foreign land as a slave to the coast, just believing from this vision he had in a dream that a ship was there waiting for him. He should have been captured. 200 miles is a long way to go on foot. But it somehow escaped the notice of his master. And he got to the coast, and sure enough, there was a ship. And he asked the sailors to take him to the continent. I think they were going to France. He asked them to take him along, and they refused. And then Patrick was bewildered and afraid. He walked away, and then a voice said to him, "Go back, ask again." So he turned around and went back, asked the captain of the ship, and miraculously he had changed his mind. Somehow the captain felt, we're supposed to take this guy, this foreign guy. And so they went back. He eventually got back to Britain. He kept having dreams. He was constantly, you'd think, 6.5 years in a slave, when in American history, when slaves escaped to the north, they didn't go back to North Carolina or Virginia at all, voluntarily. Most of the African American slaves wanted to stay in the north once they got there. But Patrick kept having dreams and visions where he would see the people of Ireland asking them to come back, return. You have a special mission here. And he couldn't get away from the constant dreams and visions he had. And eventually he decided to study for the ministry, so he could go back, could return to Ireland as a missionary. And he's spent the next 20 years of his life, I think, from age around 22 to 42, 43, studying. And eventually he got ordained as a priest, which you had to be in those days. You couldn't just decide I want to be. This was long before the Protestant Reformation, so you couldn't decide I just want to go evangelize someplace. You had to be specially ordained. So again, after 20 years of his life preparing for his mission, it was time to go back to Ireland, and he asked the Archbishop, "Can you send me to Ireland?" But there was another guy that also wanted to go. And the Archbishop, after kind of examining him, said, "We can't send you there. You're too emotional. You don't have enough of a cool head to be a missionary to Ireland," which they're making the first overtures to evangelize Ireland back around 432 AD. So they sent another guy. That guy lasted about 8 months. He was too stuffy, too intellectual. He basically wasn't the man for the job. The Irish didn't like him, so he wasn't making any headway. Remember, Ireland too at this time was a pagan, barbarian country. Wasn't Christian at all by any means. They were kind of wild warrior people that were superstitious, kind of irrational to the Romanized Britons. So that guy, he returned to Britain. The Archbishop said, okay, we'll try Patrick. And he finally sent Patrick to Ireland. And Patrick actually, because of his character and his unbelievable courage, he was able to win over the Irish people. He really had a very human heart. He really cared for people and loved people and seemed to see the best in them. Even again, it was challenging because they were kind of wild barbarians. Patrick loved the Irish, and the Irish loved Patrick. And in the next 30 years of his life, he was able to, with the help of others too, he was able to basically Christianize the whole island of Ireland, for the most part, which is really a miracle. 30 years for an entire country which had nothing to do with Christian faith to be evangelized and changed in one person's lifetime is, somewhat of a miracle. And it had, interestingly enough, it also had geopolitical implications. Because as I mentioned, Europe was basically plunged into the Dark Age. Oh, another thing I forgot to mention. Patrick also brought literacy. The Irish the Gaels were basically, they had a strong oral tradition, which they still have, but they were basically unlettered. They didn't know Latin, they didn't write. Patrick, in the generation that he worked there, again, he brought literacy. And even to this day, actually, Ireland has a very strong literary tradition. But it ended up being the only country in Europe at the time that was literate. And so as the monastery, toward the end of Patrick's life, as monasteries began to spring up in Ireland, the monks would begin copying the old classics. They would copy the old Roman classics that were salvaged from the continent. And education was very strong, actually. They ended up with a very strong educational tradition. The Irish monks actually preserved a lot of the literature that would have disappeared in Europe. People like Virgil and Cicero, part of them we know today because they were copied by Irish monks and their scriptorians and brought back to Europe. And in the 30 years after Patrick, again, there were monasteries established all over Ireland. And it was it was safe. It wasn't being invaded by barbarian tribes. Ireland didn't get invaded for another 400 years until the time of the Vikings. Again, while the rest of Europe was being overrun. And then they began sending missionaries, actually. The missionaries from Ireland ended up evangelizing the Germanic tribes of Europe in present-day France and Hungary and Poland and Italy and other places. There was a kind of echo effect of Ireland bringing Christianity back to the continent where it had begun. So there's a couple of centuries, which we don't study much in school. But those centuries after 400, 500, 600, 700 were actually very important years. The culture of Europe's literary tradition and Christianity were preserved, essentially because of the Irish monks. If you think about it, it's because of one slightly arrogant, spoiled, Romanized Briton became a slave boy, but was used by God in a very special way to kind of set the course for European civilization, which we have inherited. As Americans, we've inherited that legacy. Those thousands of years of Western European culture and history. Our traditions of freedom and integrity and the Christian foundation that we have today, we owe partly to that young Briton named Patrick. So, happy St. Patrick's Day. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day and this bright, fair weather we're having. For this profound story. We never know the unknown ways and wherefores and directions of our life and our fate. Sometimes our lives seem tremendously frustrating. But we trust that you have a hand in all that we go through, and that we try to submit ourselves to a higher trust. Thank you for inspiring, again, this young boy in very cruel circumstances to pass down to us the legacy of literacy and Christianity and all good things that you've given us. And we pray in the name of Christ our Lord, to your parents. Amen.
That's it.